guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to have a bit of a discussion today about the nutrition surrounding fruit versus dried fruit, and perhaps throw into the mix as well something about fruit juices. To illustrate what I really want to talk about, I've got 10 grapes in this container, and as you can see, the container is quite full. If you look at this container, I have 10 raisins. So nutritionally, these two containers contain virtually identical nutritional profiles, and there is one difference, and the difference between the grapes and the raisins is that the raisins have been dried, and therefore the water content of the fruit has not been eliminated, but it's been greatly reduced. Now, I'm not going to criticise dried fruit, because I think dried fruit has a place in a healthy diet, but I did want to make the caveat that because the water content of the dried fruit is reduced, dried fruit is actually slightly sweeter because the sugars are more concentrated per unit of food, and dried fruit is actually generally easier to eat. It's much easier to eat 10 raisins compared to eating 10 grapes. I think most people would agree with that. It's common sense. So fruit really, and I've talked about this before, fruit contains fructose, and fructose is an obesogenic agent. But when you consume fructose with fruit, it doesn't seem to have that same obesogenic properties. It's only when it's refined and crystalline and concentrated in processed foods. And some of the reason for that is that there is fiber in fruit, and the fiber slows the absorption of the fructose, and that prevents the nutrient overload syndrome that you tend to get with processed foods. And that gives fruit generally a better glycemic index, a better glycemic profile compared with perhaps with processed foods. But as well as the fiber, there's also water in the fruit. There's a lot of water in most fruits. There are exceptions, but most fruits contain a lot of water, and that decreases the rate at which they can be consumed. So apples, for example, it's actually quite difficult and quite time consuming to consume 3 or 4 apples, and it's a combination of the fact that there is fiber there, but really because there's a high water content for apples. It would be, for example, easier to consume calories from bananas because the water content of bananas is lower. So really what I'm trying to do here is highlight that dried fruit, raisins contain the same amount of carbohydrate, they contain the same amount of fiber, they contain the same amount of phytochemicals, as grapes, but the water content is greatly reduced. Now, does that mean that dried fruit shouldn't be part of a healthy diet? No, of course not. Dried fruit contains lots of nutrients, just as the original fruit does. It's just the water content is decreased, and therefore consuming dried fruit is no different to consuming the original fruit. But you do have to be careful, because it is much easier to overconsume dried fruit compared to eating the whole original fruit with the original water content. So that's something that most people, I think, will maybe have considered, most certainly those people that have thought about their fruit intake. Now, another thing to mention about fruit is that fruit intake, the fructose from fruit, it can be excessive if you overeat fruit. Just because fructose is in fruit doesn't mean that it doesn't have obesogenic properties. If you overconsume fruit, you will still have those detrimental obesogenic effects from the fructose. It's just that the whole fruit makes it much less likely for that to happen. And there are other factors within the fruit, there are other nutrients that actually counteract the negative effects of the fructose. But that doesn't mean that fruit won't cause insulin resistance if you eat too much of it. So you have to be careful when you're eating dried fruit. If you eat lots of it, it would still be possible for that to be obesogenic and cause weight gain and insulin resistance, for example. However, if we go to fruit juices, this is much more, fruit juices are much more nefarious in their nature. They're much more detrimental to the health, and many studies now are starting to look at fruit juices as very similar in their nutritional effects as soft drinks. Soft drinks are obesogenic because they contain sugar, high fructose corn syrup, or sometimes they have added fructose or other sugars. And the fructose component of that, in its liquid form with no fibre, if they're drunk without any additional food, can be highly obesogenic. And fruit juices are exactly the same. Fruit juices, if you imagine a number of apples, 4 or 5 apples, if you squeezed the juice out of those apples, it would be very easy to consume those five apples almost instantaneously. That juice would be almost only a mouthful, but it would take you many minutes to consume the apples. And then the apples, once you've consumed them in their whole form, they would sit in your stomach for a while. The fibre would, the soluble fibre would become a gel, and that would prevent the absorption of the sugars, for example, and therefore that fructose would take much longer to get into your system, and therefore the metabolic pathways that it stimulates won't be stimulated to such a fast rate, and therefore the detrimental effects are much lessened if you eat the whole fruit. But when you consume just the sugars, along obviously with some of the phytonutrients and the other nutrients, but really you're consuming just the sugars and the water, that really is no different from consuming soft drinks. So when you think about fruit, when you think about consuming fruit, most people think that fruit juice is actually healthy. It's something they want to give to their children, for example. It's something maybe they have at breakfast because they think it's healthy. Have orange juice or apple juice. Really, you should think that you're not really consuming anything different if you compared it to consuming a soft drink from a nutritional perspective. Apples, whole oranges, whole fruit tends to be the best way to consume fruit because it has the high water content, it has the fibre content, and obviously nothing's been removed from the fruit. It's in its original natural form. There's nothing wrong with dried fruit. Dried fruit is effectively exactly the same as the original whole fruit. It's just had the water content removed, and therefore it contains all of the fibre, all of the phytonutrients, and all of the other accessory nutrients that make fruit a very healthy food. But it's really fruit juices that you have to be careful of. These are quite nefarious in their nature. And they can have obesogenic properties very similar to soft drinks. So be wise with your food choices, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself, and I'll see you soon for another video. Please take care.